Well, thank you, first of all, Leon and Manizja, for agreeing to present your chapter or go a bit beyond the chapter on the importance of monitoring violations against journalists. It's been a pleasure to working with you on the chapters via Stacy. I'm really glad that you agreed. And also, I'm glad you agreed to give the talk today and to write a blog post. Guys, if you haven't read it yet, go to the Hub website and have a read. So what we'll do is have Leon's and Manizja's presentation for about 25-30 minutes. So we should have enough time for questions afterwards, if that works for everyone. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, if that's okay, so you can frame exactly what you would like people to know. I'll turn my microphone off now and hand over, because as much as you, Leon, I could talk for hours. So I will not, impede on your time. So please just go ahead, and thank you so much for being here, and thanks to everyone else for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning. Maybe I don't know where everybody is. This is the fascinating thing about digital webinars. Before I hand over to my colleague, Manizja Aziz, who's done the major bulwark on writing and researching the topic we're talking, I would want to give you a little bit of a reason why we think monitoring of journalism safety is important. So my name is Leon Willems. I'm Senior Advisor, International Partnerships at Free Press Unlimited. Free Press Unlimited is an international press freedom organization. We work in more than 50 countries with, 300 partners. It changes from time to time. And one of the major themes that we work on is the safety of journalists. We're not a research organization, but we sometimes do action research when we think there is something that needs more highlighting. And actually this issue was one of them. So very soon now, it's 2 November, the International Day to end impunity for violations and crimes against journalists. And the question is, why are journalists killed? Well, it's very interestingly simple, because journalists represent inconvenient truth. Inconvenient truth because they highlight things that happen in the fog of war, like we're seeing today in Gaza and other areas in the Middle East, Sudan. But also, very importantly, when journalists discover corruption, do investigations, etc. So this is why journalists are killed. And when we talk about impunity, many assume we talk about what can we do when a journalist is killed. And we thought something is missing in the research, which is how can we prevent journalists from being killed? And so this was the initial thought concept. What can we do better to make sure that we prevent the killing? And that is the first step, creating safer working conditions for journalists, etc. I'm sure many of the people who are in the chat right now are working on that. But if you want to prevent killing, you need to get a better picture of all sorts of violations that are happening. These data would then help to create better intervention strategies. Maybe you can do better effective advocacy. And maybe you can, you can track improvement or deterioration of situations that might lead to preventing some journalists from going into harm's way. So this has been the concept. What can we do with monitoring that would highlight that you can do something before a journalist is killed? Now, monitoring violations against journalists is done by many organizations, and especially when journalists are killed, there are different groups who have present different data. Give you an organization. This is by no means a situation that we want to criticize. It is basically some organizations count a cameraman, others don't. Some count drive-by shooting, others don't. Some count only cases where there's an investigation that has proven that it's because of the job that a journalist is killed. So there's this confusion sometimes about who's actually killed. And unfortunately, many governments who are trying to hide inconvenient truth are using this to say that the data of international organizations are incorrect. So this is a problem. But most organizations monitor mostly and focus mostly on killing because it's a fact. A person is dead or he or she is not dead. So a lower number of killings in a certain year can also mean that many journalists are afraid to go reporting. And so the number of journalists killed, but the threats haven't subsided. So these are all circumstances that led us to believe that a lower death toll isn't a cause for celebration. We need better information. So our hypothesis on doing this work, which we did in many combinations with the Sheffield University, the Data and Computer Science Department, our hypothesis is that killings are not a standalone event. Usually, something has happened before that if it would have been captured in time effectively, other types of harm could have been prevented. In other words, if you manage to get earlier in the stage of acts of violations, maybe you can do more to prevent killings. Example is Daphne Caruana Galizia. I'm sure everyone of you knows it. Her murder was presented by death threats, libel suits, arson attempts, the killing of her dog, etc., etc. I'm not saying that Daphne Caruana Galizia would have accepted not to stop reporting or to leave the country or whatever, but more could have been done preventively. So the hypothesis that we worked on, can better monitoring allow for earlier actions for protection and or prevention? So this was the reason why we started this work. And we think that therefore it is desirable to systematically capture various events in the chain of violations against journalists in a more, let's say, comprehensive manner. And we think that it's important to have quantitative data, but also interpretation capacity, which brings us to the idea that we should be working more to facilitate the capacity of local organizations to do a better job because they're closest to the situations. So this is how we, let's say, hypothesized our work. And that is when I now hand over to Manizja for taking you further on what we then actually did and wrote in the chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. And thank you everyone for attending today. So indeed, in our chapter, our starting point was really the safety of journalists as a starting point, because also at FPU, we see that the safety of journalists is a precondition for them to carry out their work. As Leon said, journalists around the world face killings, but they also face many other threats to their safety. These can be physical, digital, legal, sometimes interconnected with one another. And often they also have ramifications for a journalist's psychosocial safety. We also see that governments and non-state actors have found innovative ways to suppress and silence media workers beyond physical violence, such as lawsuits, internet shutdowns, and also threats to journalist family members. This poses a significant threat to press freedom and access to reliable information, as it may also result in so-called media dark areas, where independent and critical reporting is lacking entirely. This is very problematic as journalists have an essential role in society. They keep democracy alive and thriving. They keep the public informed. They keep power holders accountable, and they act as a watchdog. And as a result of these threats, as Leon already said, journalists may exercise self-censorship. They stay silent, they leave their profession, or they disappear into exile. And this cycle of violence and intimidation can create an atmosphere of impunity. The statistics still show that 8 out of 10 cases of reported killings of journalists remain unresolved. So in short, in order to fulfill their vital role, journalists need to be able to do their work safely. because threats to journalist safety also constitute a threat to access to information. And that is why the safety of journalists as a precondition for access to information is also enshrined in the SDG agenda, as you can see here. So in 2015, Target 1610, access to information, was recognized by the UN as an essential requirement towards promoting peaceful and inclusive societies. And one of the two indicators that falls under Target 1610 is SDG indicator 1610-1. And this specific indicator recognizes the safety of journalists as a precondition for access to information, but also for the promotion of peaceful, inclusive societies for sustainable development, which is SDG 16. So as you have seen in the table that Leon showed, many organizations may arrive at different results when monitoring killings against journalists. And this disparity is caused by several factors. So organizations may use different definitions of a journalist. So they may include certain media workers, and organizations may use different methods in determining or assessing whether a violation took place in connection to the journalist's work, or whether the violation took place in a personal sphere, for example. And organizations may use different categories of violations. So connected to the last point, FPU has worked extensively with the Center for Freedom of the Media, CFAM, of the University of Sheffield. And as part of their research, CFAM has also developed this classification of violations against journalists based on the SDG agenda. And the importance of having standardized definitions and harmonized data is that it enables us to compare data across countries. It also allows for better trend analysis and the development of more effective intervention strategies. So when it comes to the monitoring of violations against journalists, we see that states have a duty to protect journalists and to uphold access to information, which is enshrined in several international human rights instruments, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And there are two relevant frameworks under which states ought to report on the safety of journalists: the already mentioned SDG agenda and the Universal Periodic Review. So when it comes to the SDG agenda, we have the so-called Voluntary National Review, the VNR. And each year during the high-level political forum, nation states get the chance to present national progress made in implementing the SDG agenda. But the VNR is, as the name suggests, a soft accountability mechanism, as nation states can voluntarily sign up to conduct the VNR. The UPR, on the other hand, is a mechanism from the UN Human Rights Council. Nation states are encouraged to report on the human rights situation in their country through the UPR, which is a recurrent obligatory review mechanism, the so-called human rights exam. And the UPR gives member states a chance to offer each other recommendations on how to improve the human rights situation in their respective countries. But these recommendations are not legally binding. So we see that both mechanisms have great potential, but in practice, many states are reluctant to report on the safety of journalists. We also have data showing that since 2015, most states have been reluctant or negligent to monitor developments falling under SDG indicator 1610-1. So we see that the main issues are the lack of this detailed monitoring data and the lack of implementation in countries. So even when there is data on killings or other violence, states are sometimes negligent to follow up on this data and to actually have implementing measures in place. So this is where the highly important role of civil society comes in. Civil society has the potential to hold nation states accountable through monitoring and the collection of data that can supplement or even replace the data that is provided by nation states. So shadow reporting enables in-country CSOs to highlight their perspective on the progress of SDG implementation, especially when there is a lack of political will by nation states to provide relevant data on SDG indicator 1610-1. 2 years ago, FPU organized a workshop in The Hague where we organized a lot of monitoring CSOs, local regional monitoring CSOs, to find out what issues they are facing in monitoring violations. And we came to the following conclusions. So first of all, many organizations face a lack of resources and capacity. Monitoring and analyzing violations against journalists is time-consuming, it requires a specific set of skills, and many local organizations do not have the funds to hire a staff member that specifically focuses on monitoring or to provide their staff members with the necessary training. Second, many CSOs which operate in repressive and hostile environments are met with resistance and threats. This makes it extremely difficult for them to bring violations against journalists to light. And finally, CSOs often face a lack of reliable and methodologically consistent data that they can rely upon, especially in countries where governmental sources are lacking. So they may use other sources such as online sources or self-reporting by journalists or media houses, but we do see that some violations are underreported, such as violations against women journalists, violations happening inside the newsroom, and online violations. So to sum up, monitoring violations against journalists is essential to gain a better understanding of the risks that journalists face and the action and advocacy that is needed to address these risks. And in this regard, efforts by CSOs are crucial as they add legitimacy. To that end, local capacity of CSOs needs to be enhanced so they can continue to keep states accountable through their shadow reporting. In order to compare data across countries, it is important that CSO's data is compatible with a standard. As currently, numerous definitions and methodologies are used by different organizations. So aligning the monitoring methodologies with the SDG framework, so SDG indicator 1610.1, will help in strengthening VNR and GDPR shadow reporting. However, in monitoring violations, it is necessary to move beyond the collection of data on killings alone, because monitoring killings will fall short in helping us to understand shifting trends in journalist safety and giving us in-depth insight into dynamics and nature of threats. So we need the qualitative data to really add on to the quantitative data. I will leave it at that. Do you have anything to add, Leon?
No, I think we have a good collection of people attending the webinar, so let's open up for questions.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I had to turn my camera off because my internet went all weird. But I have listened. Who has any questions? If you just raise your hand, that'll be great, or put it in the chat. Actually going to stop the recording because that allows for better, hang on, communication.